There is perhaps no more endearing image of the witch than her astride a broom set against a harvest moon on a midnight journey to join her coven deep within a forest or high atop a mountain. From medieval woodcuts to Samantha of Bewitched fame to Robert Eggers' masterful depiction of 17th century New England, this image of the witch has endured for centuries. Though the origins of flight via the broom and the nightly gathering of witches is a surprisingly complex story, in fact it took centuries for this image to coalesce from significantly disparate tracks into a unified composite myth now referred to by scholars as the elaborated theory of witchcraft. From pre-Christian folklore and medicinal practices to the rise of the Inquisition and early modern witch hunts, let's explore the origins of this notion of flight upon a broom and the nightly gathering of the Sabbat of the witches. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, make sure to check out my Patreon or perhaps consider supporting the work via a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really do appreciate your consideration of supporting the project of this channel. But now let's turn to the witch's flight to the Sabbath. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Before getting started, it's worth making an important distinction between the people, mostly women, prosecuted for witchcraft in the late medieval and early modern periods, the notion of the witch as it developed in the minds of inquisitors and witch hunters, and the contemporary people who identify as witches as part of their religious and spiritual vocations. For the purposes of this episode, I'm going to stipulate or reserve the term witch for what scholars refer to as the elaborated theory of witchcraft. This is the mature notion of witchcraft as developed in the minds of inquisitors, jurists, theologians, and philosophers of the late medieval and early modern period that held that a newly formed woman-led heretical sorcery sect had appeared in Europe, marked by entering into a pact or covenant with the devil, and thus apostasy from Christianity. This would include sexual relations with the devil and demons more generally, aerial flight for the purposes of attending a nightly assembly or Sabbath, sometimes a synagogue, which is presided over by, well, Satan himself, at which initiates entered into said pact, followed by incestuous and promiscuous sex, along with the general practice of evil magic, the slaughtering of fetuses and babies, and various means for preventing human procreation, whose aim was to basically undermine all of Christendom as part of the devil's ongoing war with God. In fact, by the mid-15th century, the theory took on positively apocalyptic dimensions by arguing that the new witch heresy was part of a final putsch on the part of Satan to forestall his impending doom, by sending human beings down a spiral of sin and crime as the final outrage to God. Regardless, the elaborated theory of witchcraft, while it varied from region to region or writer to writer, had more or less coalesced by around 1450 to 1500, and thus set the stage for the frenzied persecutions which would follow, resulting in the deaths of somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women, in the period up to around 1750. And it was in that elaborated theory of witchcraft that aerial flight and the nightly gathering of the witches took shape and became central tropes of that myth, though this process was centuries in the making. The Sabbath, as it's generally known in English, was the supposed night gathering of these sorcery heretics, arrived at through magical or otherwise demonic flight, in which they would meet with the devil, copulate with him, and they would sacrifice children and, well, eat them, along with admitting others into the heretical movement. Generally speaking, these meetings would take place rather distant from the homeland of the alleged witch, often on mountains or sometimes as far away as Newfoundland, and could feature enormous numbers of participants. Even hundreds of thousands are attested in some of these confessions. Confessions, of course, arrived at through torture, though this is a key feature in the elaborated theory of witchcraft, that hundreds, if not thousands, or even tens of thousands of heretics were allegedly present at the Sabbat, led inquisitors to the belief that this heretical movement did, in fact, threaten all of Christendom with such a heretical witch army under the sway of the devil. Heretical witch army. Band name alert. And given such titanic numbers, any confession should also include naming other members of this so-called heresy. The centrality of the Sabbath myth cannot be overstated in the ballooning of the witch trials. The purported size of these gatherings led to the extraction of further names, which reinforced the myth of the size of the sorcery heresy. This feedback loop once began, and then short-circuited, of course, through the use of interrogational torture, practically guaranteed a geometric increase in the scope of the trials, confessions, and executions. Curiously enough, the term that has now become associated with these night gathering of witches, Sabbat, is actually not terribly common in the historical literature on the so-called sorcery heresy. It's nearly entirely missing in the German literature, and it tends to appear primarily in the French witch-hunting literature, though even there it's pretty still spare in use. In fact, the term synagogum fascinorum is perhaps one of the more early terms for such a gathering, and this actually gives us a clue into the complex origins of the so-called night gatherings. Scholars have located several interlocking notions which coalesced over centuries to produce the myth of these mass night Sabbaths, or synagogues. The most proximate elements are the hangovers from the anti-Waldensian and anti-Cathar campaigns, which reached their height through the 13th century. Here, the medieval church drew upon traditional anti-heretical and anti-Semitic slurs found primarily in patristic literature to lampoon and denigrate the population of their enemies, both real and, well, mostly imagined. This layer of slander would include things like secret gatherings in which promiscuous and incestuous sex would take place, meetings with demonic entities would occur, and of course the classic tropes of infanticides and abortions would take place. The latter there may be connected to perceived Cathar antinatalism, though this connection is admittedly rather tenuous, to be honest. Ironically, these very slurs actually have their origins in anti-Christian propaganda on the part of the Romans, who saw the literally underground meetings of the early Christians as bound up with all manner of sexual immorality and, well, cannibalism, that whole eat my body and drink my blood stuff. The Romans kind of took that stuff real literally. Indeed, one imagines that such slander, sexual sins, cannibalism, and infanticide are probably just part of the stock arsenal of, well, horrific stuff easily heaped upon any outsider social group, so as to paint them as dreadfully as possible. Though there may be at least one element of truth to all this. Toward the end of the anti-Waldensian campaigns, the remaining members of the movement did in fact flee to the mountains near the borders of France, Italy, and Switzerland, and there is good evidence of their secret gatherings in that region. Of course, they were meeting in secret because they were a persecuted minority. Further, the earliest sorcery cases that form the first stratum of the witch trials also begin in exactly this region, with even the local dialects incorporating the terms for Waldensians and Cathars as words directly associated with sorcery. To this day, there are words in French that mean magician and sorcerer that come from these terms. Another element related to the ones I just mentioned are a specifically anti-Semitic adjunct where, again, the notion that Jews secretly kill Christian children to use their blood for the preparation of religious bread, the stealing and desecration of the Eucharistic host, the notion of Jews as especially taken with magic and poisoning, along with the prevalent use of terms like Sabbat and synagogue to describe their gatherings, well, first on the Jews, then on the Waldensians, and then for the witches. There's a kind of Venn diagram of conspiracy theories here, which I actually refer to technically as conspiracy comorbidity. Rarely does someone just believe in one conspiracy theory, they tend to believe in tons of them, where anti-Semitism and anti-heresy will cross-pollinate with each other as part of the emerging conspiracy theory of early modern witchcraft. Note the theological move here from vague synagogues of witches with the synagogue of Satan mentioned as part of the apocalyptic final days in the final book of the New Testament. Regardless, the first development seems to have been a kind of slander transfer between the generalized medieval anti-Semitism and anti-heresy campaigns of the High Middle Ages to the emergent sorcery sect, which became eventually the fully elaborated theory of witchcraft in the early modern period. The first elements of which do appear in the Irish trial of Dame Alice Kittler in 1324-1325, where notions of sex with demons, the use of clothing from dead, unbaptized children to make various kinds of potions, and belonging to a heretical sect that met at night resulted in Kittler fleeing Ireland and vanishing into history, while her maid was eventually executed as a sorceress. In fact, in some ways, she's one of the first victims of the witch trials. While this trial retains many medieval elements, especially the focus on sorcery in the aristocratic classes, the foundation was set and would be more fully developed in texts like the Directorium Inquisitorum and especially the fifth book of Nider's Formicarius. Though the inquisitors, theologians, and jurists all faced a common problem with the logistics of the Sabbath. How could droves of women leave their homes in the night and make their way to these nocturnal meetings before returning home in the morning with no one noticing and with them traveling great distances? The early confessions seem to actually have introduced an element from folk beliefs into the theological conversation more generally about the nature of the sorcery heresy. And it's here that we get the idea of the flight of the witch. There was just one problem with this answer from the academic, theological, and legal perspective. Well, common sense and basic understanding of physics. Nope, none of that played any part in any role in this. Nope, we're in the intellectual nightmare that was the Middle Ages. Nope, the problem with the argument that witches flew to the Sabbath was centuries established canon law. The church had already made it clear early on that such flight is a theological absurdity. Kinda. Among the earliest systematic texts of canon law is the important Decretum of Gratian, compiled and written sometime in the mid-12th century. For this study, the most important section of that massive text is the so-called Canon Episcopi, found at Causa 26, Quaestio 5, Canon 12, if you want to look it up. This text actually predates the Decretum by centuries. It's first attested around 906 of the Common Era and probably reflects the attitudes of the period just after the conversion of the Franks from paganism and the pretty early years of the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, it's an important window onto the pagan pre-Christian world of that time. This text urges local bishops to eradicate the practice of magic and divination from the recently converted population. However, this is to be accomplished not by torturing or killing said practitioners, at least not yet, but by expelling them from their parishes, and it is only after repeated admonitions against such practices that a person can actually be deemed a heretic. The text also mentions the idea that certain women believe that they can ride beasts with Diana to join in collective worship of this pagan goddess. Of course, this is perhaps one of the earliest mentions of something like flight to the witch's Sabbat, though here notice that that flight is actually not mentioned. They ride upon beasts, nor is the devil. These women are traveling with the goddess Diana or some similar local pagan deity. Further, and this is pretty crucial, the Canon Episcopi makes it clear that the journey to worship Diana is a, quote, phantasm imposed upon the mind by demonic forces, and that the women do not, in fact, physically travel anywhere. The travel upon the beasts and the collective worship of Diana is a demonic delusion and not actual geographic travel. Further, there's also a condemnation of the idea of shape-shifting, perhaps again reflecting a local pagan belief of transforming into animals or other shamanic practices of this period. Indeed, we read in the Canon Episcopi that a person that believes in such shape-shifting is procul dubio infidelis et pagano deterior. They're beyond doubt an infidel and worse than a pagan. Don't worry, I'll be making separate episodes on the concept of shape-shifting, pacts with the devil, sexual copulation with demons, as we continue to explore the origins of the cumulative theory of witchcraft, so stay tuned for those. The point here is that such flights were already a non-starter from the position of canon law, but who's going to let that get in the way of killing thousands of innocent people? Not these guys, that's who. So yes, to solve the problem of the logistics of the Sabbat, let's torture people who then claim to fly, believe them, and overturn established legal traditions in order to execute them. That's insane, right? Yeah, but if you slow down crazy far enough, the people falling into that abyss don't tend to see it. So, increasingly through the 15th century, the concept of flight was introduced and then theologically justified. The first movement was to point out that while the Canon Episcopi accurately described the riding upon beasts with Diana as phantasmic, that was only true for that specific pagan delusion. The sorcery heresy argued these inquisitors was, well, new, and the devil was pulling out all the stops in his last-ditch effort to forestall his own doom. Thus, flight, at least at first mentally, then physically, was being performed by the new diabolical sect. This argument proceeded with the idea that members of the cult were actually mentally flown to the Sabbath by demonic power. This in some ways maintains the position of the Canon Episcopi, but still allows for a shared phantasmic intercourse with the devil for members of the sorcery heresy. However, belief in actual flight began to appear in the early to mid 15th century. Here, the reasoning was that the devil could control local motion and especially had power in the zone between the moon and the surface of the earth. The devil has long been thought to have dominion over airy regions. You can see this as far back as the book of Job. Thus, the devil could snatch up his followers into the air and relocate them to the Sabbat. Of course, this also reinforced the idea that the devil alone was responsible for the magical malfeasance of the alleged witches, and that their flight was never under their own power. It was always the result of demonic power. Thus, by the 16th century and the most frenzied period of the witch trials, the flight of the witch was both an established trope and had a substantial amount of theological support. However, there remained skeptics, and it was actually continued flight skepticism that was the starting point for the breakdown of the belief in this whole horrifying mess to begin with. But how did the flight myth actually begin? As I mentioned earlier, it seems that this element was introduced into the earliest trials from the victims of the trials themselves and may reach back to pre-Christian elements in European folk belief, along with folk medicinal practices and their respective combination and heretification. Heretification is a fantastic word. You should use it as much as you can. The first movement here is a cluster of pre-Christian beliefs in which women were believed to be transformed into strigai or screech owls or lamii in order to attack, suck the blood, or just eat infants. A second element would be the survival, actually mentioned in the canon Episcopi, where women would ride into the night with Diana along with the hordes of the dead on nocturnal hunts and processions. These beliefs would take a range of forms, but seemed rather popular folk belief through all of Europe. The most famous example of them being the Benedanti, who would transform in visionary states into various creatures to fight against witches to secure the fertility of their land and harvests of their communities, as described in Ginsberg's very famous study, The Night Battles. Prior to the 14th century, such accounts weren't really taken seriously by the official academics, theologians, and inquisitors, but ideas of transformation and especially flight were now near necessary features of the emergent sorcery sect theory. Thus began the process of heretification. Folk ideas once dismissed were now converted into the theological, juridical worldview of the Inquisition in order to explain diabolical flight and prosecute those that allegedly did so. This process would also be extended to the world of folk medicine as well, especially in the case of the famed flying ointment. While it has to be admitted that the evidence is rather spare prior to the early modern era, it does seem that psychedelic plant-based ointments were in widespread use prior to the witch trials for a range of reasons, perhaps ritual, but certainly recreational. Of course, this dovetails with the long-held association of the witch as a poisoner, an idea found already back in the Greek translation of the Bible from Hebrew, where machashefa, or sorceress, was rendered as pharmakous, which can be read as poisoner. Though the earliest anxiety was actually not about flight, but various delirium-inducing erotic binding potions, and of course, well, outright poisoning people. In fact, the path of the poisoner witch to the flying witch is still difficult to historically trace exactly. The link here seems to be a set of widely known but poorly attested folk ointments containing a range of powerful and frankly dangerous deliriants and soporifics. And like the myth of flight itself, the flying ointment also seems to have evolved as it underwent the process of heretification. The first phase seems to largely involve the idea that women are allegedly using various kinds of potions and ointments to induce insanity, transform into beasts, cause sexual excitement, the sensation of flight, and, well, kill people. This is a trope that dates back well before even Christianity. But beginning in the mid-14th and early 15th centuries, these women folk medical practitioners underwent the process of heretification as the trials amped up, whereby the ointments associated with flight would be those of the most keen interest to the Inquisition. They need to explain how people are flying to get to these Sabbaths. The final phase, in which we learn a great deal more about the contents of these alleged ointments, would be when skeptics and proto-scientists such as Johann Weyer and Giambattista della Porta would argue that such compounds actually just induce delirium and the sensation of flight, but do not allow physical flight to the Sabbat. Of course, it also appears that theologians knew about the effects of such compounds, but were only interested again in attributing their power to the devil in the more furtherance of their larger agenda, the prosecution of the so-called sorcery heresy. While the earliest attested ointments in the witch trials, the earliest being around 1428, rarely describe the contents of these ointments, and when they do, it's often psychedelically inert substances such as bat's blood, soot, or fat rendered from murdered children, later and parallel accounts do provide just such a glimpse. We actually learn from later accounts what may have been in some of these delirium-inducing compounds. The problem, at least for an evidentiary perspective, is that the accounts of flight, the use of the ointments for flight, and the documents actually describing the contents that could have caused such sensations never quite line up either historically or documentarily. Thus, the connection will likely remain somewhat conjectural, and this has actually led, unfortunately, to a situation where scholars and amateur historians both dismiss psychedelic use in these situations and exaggerate the role of psychedelics in the development of the flight. Neither of those positions are probably accurate. Regardless of the exact connection, it's clear that such psychedelic compounds did exist and played some role in the development of the flight and Sabbath myths. Though, the image of the broom-flying witch has made a huge impression because of its depiction both in art and in pop culture, despite flight in the actual historical trial records being achieved much more often through things like transformation or flight atop chairs, inside of bowls and baskets, fence posts, shovels, short rods, sticks, or just by falling into a sleep or a coma. In fact, the most constant form of flight in the literature was atop piles of mule and horse feces, of all things. In most cases, flight was recorded as having been achieved with neither ointment nor medium of travel. One was simply whisked away into the air by the devil. Finally, it's worth mentioning here that the argument put forward only as recently as the 1970s that this ointment was applied to objects which were either rubbed or inserted into the vagina has basically no support from historical records. It's no record of that. Virtually all records indicate that the ointment was just sort of slathered all over the body. In fact, many of the alkaloids responsible for the hallucinogenic elements of these ointments are in fact fat-soluble and thus could be applied anywhere on the body, presumably. If you want to explore a more detailed analysis of these types of compounds and ointments, check out my episode on Della Porta's natural magic. His incredibly famous volume describes such compounds at length, though I'll give the same warning here that I gave in that episode. Never, ever attempt experiments with such compounds. They appear often to contain powerful deliriants that have caused death even in the recent past. People still die trying to use these flying ointments. Again, don't. The myth of the witch's Sabbath and the flight astride a broomstick have entered deeply into the popular imagination. But of course, such images took centuries to develop, and scholars are still coming to understand just how such concept evolved over time and region. In future episodes, I'll be exploring other aspects of the elaborated theory of witchcraft, including pacts with the devil, which also appear in ritual magic of the time as well, shape-shifting, and the debates around demonic copulation with human beings. Man, the Middle Ages was completely crazy. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thanks for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.